Hi, my name is Emil, and today we're going to be talking about the economic impact of immigration and from primarily a Nordic perspective. So what should we think that the economic impact of immigration is? And one way to look at it is to look at what expert opinion is as a kind of rough start to reality. And if we do that, there is a survey by this economist polling website organization, and they've asked about the economic impact of refugees in Germany. And so this refers to the people who came in from Syria and related countries in 2014 and to 2016, 17, something like this, and whether they will be a net economic benefit for German citizens over the succeeding decade. And if we look at the raw response, it's basically that there's two camps. There's basically there's 40% of people who say that they think it will be a net positive, and there's 30-something% of people who say they don't know, and then there's another like 5% over here hiding. So it's roughly 50-50. And if you weigh it by experts' confidence, it's more or less the same. One thing to note about a survey like this one is that it's based on public replies. So responses. So they've asked economists, and they go on a website, and you can read what each big name economist what they said, and sometimes they provide a justification as well. So if we go to the website, we can see here's the graph, and we see Asimoglu thinks it's a good idea, and this guy thinks it's uncertain, and good idea, and no opinion, and so forth. And sometimes I have an explanation here. Sometimes, and these are amusing. But we also know that surveys based on public responses tend to be potentially biased because people answer surveys in a way that they seem good, or they don't want to be politically harassed or something. So we at least have a nagging doubt that these survey results don't really indicate what the real economist belief is on the topic. And maybe also another option is that they didn't poll the right people. They polled a lot of big name people, and maybe these people have unrepresentative views. So what we're going to do instead is that we're going to be looking at some actual data from mostly from the Nordic countries, and see how is it that we should think about economic impact of immigration. So first off, why do we care about the Nordic perspective? There's multiple reasons. The four large Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, they're global front runners in many ways. Very high human development index, low crime rates, high public trust, lots of good science, relatively atheistic countries, and relatively high fertility insofar as developed countries are concerned. So if these countries cannot make immigration worthwhile, then you don't really have too much of a hope that someone else can do it. The second reason to go for the Nordic countries is that they have great register data, and the reason for this is that decades ago the administrations decided that we need to have a unique ID for every person, the CPR number in Denmark. And what is every public database of something, crime records, tax records, medical records, all of these are linked with the same unique ID for every person, which means that you can link all these databases if you have access, and that means you can do basically essentially perfect statistics as far as the state data is concerned. And also allows for, of course, very large studies, since your only limitation is the population size of these countries, which is something like 20 million total, 25. Also, for these countries, the immigration debate has been ongoing for decades, and there is now a lot of public reports you can find and read, and a lot of figures. The main limitation of these is that they are mostly in Nordic the languages of the Nordic countries. So I can't read Finnish, but I can read Scandinavian, and so we can go through some of the figures, and I'll be translating them as we go along. We also are going to be focusing on Denmark, mainly because I know the results for the Danish reports the best, because I've been reading them for, I don't know, maybe a decade. And I think also there are more reports for Denmark than the other countries, because I think Denmark is the least woke of the 3 Scandinavian countries, and maybe also Finland. I'm not sure about Finland exactly. The typical report is going to be something that comes from like the Minister of Finance, like this one, Finance Minister, and it's the immigration's net economic impact for the public finances in the year blah blah blah. And there's a bunch of these reports, and we're going to be looking at results from them. So the very basics of figuring out the economic net benefit or impact of a group or a person is essentially you do some calculations where you try to figure out every tax benefit associated with a person. So anytime the state makes some kind of money, that's income tax, sales tax, any other kind of tax you can think of, and then you subtract every cost the state has, and that will be things like education, crime, healthcare use, pensions, any kind of thing, any other benefits use. So there's basically 2 ways for this, is that there are some things that you can use the registered data, and you can figure out how much money each person has spent on the doctor, because healthcare is publicly financed. So you can check the medical record. You can see this patient has got, this person has gone this many times to the doctor, and since the public is covering this cost, you can see how much does that cost. They're spending this much money on medicine or like subsidized medicine, and so on. You can do the same thing for income tax. You can see how much they paid for all the time. You can make an estimate about how much they maybe have paid in different ways by sales tax. So you're estimating how much money they're essentially spending. The state doesn't have access to your bank records without without being a police matter, but they can estimate. They do know how much money you're spending, how much is going into your house, this sort of thing. There are some costs that you can't individualize like this, and these are mainly costs for things like roads, and for this the typical approach is basically just to split them among every person equally. And you can do it like this, and eventually you end up with the total cost and a total income for each person. You subtract these from each other, you get the net benefit. And so that's what most of these reports is about. This table shows an overview in Danish about the things that they're counting in and in which model. And so this one is the collective expenses. These are like various benefits the public is giving you instead of income. So this will be like student stipends, pensions, other kind of disability pensions, and so on. These are going to be particular tax. This one is income from a capital stocks gains, this sort of thing, and there's a bunch of other stuff. The basic point of showing this is basically just is that you can do it very elaborately because you have the register data. The very basics of this kind of calculation looks like this, and in figure 2 here what we have is each color is a kind of expense, and the age is over here. So you can see that from age 0 to about age 60 or so, the cost of a given person is constant, although the distribution of what kind of cost differs over time. And the green one here is health, and we can see the health is large when people are old, and it's only really starts growing at age 60 or 50 or so. The red one here is education, which unsurprisingly is mostly in the early ages, so there's not much before age 5 because people don't go to school before that, and there's not much after age 30 because almost everybody is done with education. The remaining education will be stuff like people who are doing retraining, or people who are very late or at finishing the degrees, this sort of thing. It's not necessarily we know exactly what the other ones are, but you get the basic picture. What we really see is that expenses really only go up after age 70, and that's mainly due to health and other social expenses. I'm assuming these refers to things like getting aid or living at retirement homes, this sort of thing. And this one also covers pensions. The orange one is transfer income, like unemployment benefits. And if you also do the same thing for state income, what you get is this graph. And so the red one is the same one we're seeing here, except it's reversed, so it starts being large over here. And the blue one is the income, and so that is whatever money the state is making of you. And what we see is basically before age 18 or so, the state doesn't make any money at all from you, and that's for the very simple reason is that you're not paying any tax, and all the money you're spending is almost entirely something your parents are making, so you're basically just kind of spending it indirectly for them, and they don't count it for you. If we subtract these two values, we get the green line, which is the net benefit line, and we can see that it's negative before age 22 or so, and it becomes negative again after age 75 or so. Most people stop working about age 70, and the reason it's not entirely negative before that is because many people don't retire entirely, and they also have a lot of income from capital gains that they've accumulated throughout their lives. The reason it goes to about 0 over here is sometimes they state it's a modeling kind of quirk, or another way of saying it kind of probably doesn't matter because very, very few people live to be 100 years, so we don't need to be too concerned about this quirk. One thing that matters a lot is the age distribution, and because that's very simple, because if you have everybody in the population is below age 20, they're only sucking in resources, they're not contributing anything back because they're all in schooling, or if they're all very old, you get the same. And so from a state perspective, a perfect citizen is one that somehow appears in the country after the age of 22 or so and disappears again by age 70. And so if you have different social groups, the age distribution will sometimes differ a lot. And what we have here is that this is the age distribution of immigrants, so these will be first generation immigrants. The dark blue is the Danish reference, so these are the proportion of persons of Danish origin from 0 to 9 years old, 10 to 19, and so on. And we can see the Danish one is kind of flat. It's mostly evenly large generations, except to the end where people start dying. But for the non-Western ones, we see that the first generation non-Western ones, they're heavily concentrated in the working age population. Not so many very young people, because generally speaking these would be second generations, and not so many very old ones because they haven't been here long enough. And the same is true for the Western immigrants. But if we look at the second generation, we see a much different pattern. So the dark blue is again the Danish reference, and these two are the second generation Western and the non-Westerns. And so what we see is that these are almost entirely below 30, or at least below 40. And that means that all the ones who are here are all net negatives right now because they don't pay any tax and they use welfare and education, this sort of thing. And the ones here contribute a bit, but there's not really enough of them to counteract the other ones here. So this will tell us that the second generations will be net negatives even before we have to look at any other stats, because they're simply not in the part of life where they're making a contribution enough yet. If we look instead at the overall impacts, we can see the same kind of plot we had before, but here it's broken down by Danish origin, first generation Western, and first generation non-Westerns. And what we see is that for the Danish one, it's more or less as we saw before, and the Western ones, it's almost the same, except that it's somewhat less here. So Western immigrants, first generation, are somewhat worse deal than Danes are, simply because when they're at their top in their 50s, 40s, 60s, they contribute less than Danes do, and they still spend the same amount of money when they're young and old. For the non-Western immigrants, we see that the line is below 0 the entire life, and what this means is that on average, the average person of non-Western origin, first-generation immigrant, is never a net benefit for the Danish state. They simply don't earn enough money compared to the proportions of them that are unemployed or spending money on healthcare or some other thing. And so we can see this is kind of a very stark result, and it baffles you first, and that how can even working age people be a net negative, and apparently it can be so. What we can do about this is that we can look at the groups as a whole, the Danish origin, the Western first generations, the Western second generations, the non-Western first generations, and the non-Western second generations. And the dark blue line here is the actual age distribution. And so we see that Danish people are a slight net benefit, and what this basically tells you is that anyone who doesn't have as good a line as the Danish one here, these people will be below average and they will be net negatives. And if we look at the Western immigrants, we look at the actual distribution, we see that it's somewhat positive for the individual person, but if you look at the age standardized version, it's here and it's essentially 0. And we know why this is the case, because when we looked at the age distribution just before, we can see that most of the Western immigrants are working age. They're not very old and they're not very young. So we basically know that there will be an age effect that goes towards being positive net benefit for these two groups, both the non-Western and the Western ones. And so this is what we see here, is that the adjusted, the blue light value that can't be seen here, it's lower than the other one. And if we look at the first generation non-Westerns, it's here. We see that just like we see in this plot, that this line is negative, and if we adjust for the age, it's more negative. Adjusting for the age here just means that we assume the age distribution is the same as the Danish one. So we're running a model saying that what would be the net economic benefit of this group if it were to have the same age distribution as the Danish one. If we now look at the second generation Westerns and the second generation non-Westerns, we see that these are both very negative in reality currently with the age distribution, and that doesn't surprise us because we know that the second generations are very young on average, and so they're not paying any income tax and they're mostly spending money on schooling. And we see that if we age adjust the non-Western or the Western second generations, there's slight benefit. They basically catch up a little bit from the first generations, and so maybe there's some slight integration problem, or maybe the second generation Westerns are different people than the first generation ones. We can't really tell from this kind of data. For the second generation non-Western ones, we see that if we standardize for age, adjust for age, they're still a large net negative, but not as much as they currently are, and that's because they're very young. A different way of looking at the same thing as before is that we plot these lines, but for both the first and the second generation immigrants, and also for Western and non-Western. And so for first generation, we see it like this. You get, this is the Western one, and we see that the Danish one is the dark blue background here, and we see that the first generation, the red one here, is slightly below, the same as in the other chart, and the second generation, efterkommer, is the follow-ups. It's very wiggly, and that's just because we don't have that many Western second generations to draw the model from, and so we probably should have smoothed the line, but they chose not to do this, and so we get this very wiggly one, but we get the pattern. The turquoise light blue line is almost exactly the same as the Danish one, and so that's giving you the value you see here. It's slightly positive. If, however, we look at the second generations over here, we see that the second generation, or not the second generation, the non-Westerns, we see the same red line as before. It's net negative their entire lives, so age standardized, it will also be summed up to a net negative. And if we look at the second generation, we see that there is a lot of improvement. The line is now net positive about after age 30 or so, but it's only slightly positive and not enough for it to balance out the money they're spending in the early part and the later part of the life. And so if you were to draw the rest of this curve based on estimates, you would get this line that they've produced here, this amount. And the reason simply they don't draw more is that we don't have that many non-Western second generations yet, and so we have to make some kind of rough assumptions in how the distribution would be. So they basically extrapolate from the Danish values. A different way of looking at it, and here we'll be looking at Norwegian data, is that they have different classifications. Instead of Western, non-Western, and Danish, they have Norwegian and country group 1, 2, and 3. And they have quite similar interpretation. Is group 1 is Western countries, so these are all the kind of original Northwest European countries, think NATO, this sort of thing. G2 is anything that's not that, so it's anything that's entered the EU since then, so this will be countries like Romania or Croatia, something like this, Poland. And G3 is anything else, which is essentially non-Western. In the Danish data, they include the other EU into Western. So these two will be Western in Danish and non-Western. And here we're looking at the employment rates for this one is men and this one is women, and we're looking at people aged 25 to 75 in this year. And see the percentages. We see that the Norwegians are quite working a lot. About 90% of men are employed in some kind of way, and for the Western group, the orange line, it's almost the same, which is kind of similar to what we saw in the Danish data. For the other European, other EU, we see that it's somewhat below. So we know that Romanians, Croatians, this sort of thing, they do better than non-Westerns as a whole, but they don't do as well as the natives. So if you import a lot of these people and they get to live out their lives in the Scandinavian country, they will end up being net negatives on average. And we see the same kind of pattern for the non-Westerns, is that even though they hit about an employment rate of 90%, average 30, like everybody else, they decline faster, and this will have a huge economic effect. If you look at the women instead, it's more or less the same, except that the age pattern is much stronger for women. They don't ever hit 90%, they hit like 75 or so, and then they decline already did. So basically the main problem in, say, Norway here is that they can't get non-Western women to work enough, and also that when they work they earn less money. But mainly they're not working enough. If they could get this line up here, they would get better outcomes. And just to reiterate what is always the case in these things, the net benefit is a distribution within each group, and so you can talk about the average of a group, but that doesn't mean, of course, that every person within that group is the same as the average, right? And one way of looking at this is you can look at bar charts like this, and these are again Danish data, and so this means Danish origin, first generation Western, second generation Western, first generation non-Western, and second generation non-Western. And so they've colored them by 4 things, or by 4 colors, depending on the income contribution. And so what we're interested in here is we want to look at the red plus the green, and the red is green, or the red is slightly positive, and the green is very positive. So we can see that when we're looking at working age people, 25 to 64 years old, something like 75% of Danes or so are net positive, and there's a very large fraction of them, about 30%, that are above 200,000 Danish a year, or maybe it's through lifetime. For the other groups, you can see this distribution is not looking as good, and in particular the white blue or the light blue line or proportion here is quite large, especially for the non-Western first generations here and second generation, which is that these people are the ones who are net negative. And a different way of plotting this is we just plot the same groups, but we look at just the proportion that are positive. And so for Danish people, it's about 70%, which is what I almost estimated there. And for other groups, it's less. Especially first generation non-Western is bad, where only 30-40% of the working age population is a net benefit, which is quite stark. It gets better for the second generation, maybe 50%, but that's not enough to outweigh the cost that these people incur when they are in young and old. If we look at countries of origin, you get unsurprising results. There are very large differences between immigration groups depending on where they're from. If you look at countries, since we already looked at Western and non-Western, we know that there are going to be country differences. And what they've done here is that they're colored by Western and non-Western. So the dark blue, these ones, are basically, almost all of them are net negative. A few exceptions are India and China, and I think this one is Ukraine. So you can say Ukraine is a different European non-EU country that is in Denmark, at least in this year, slightly net beneficial. And probably no one is surprised that Chinese are a net benefit, and Indians are also a net benefit currently. And this is kind of like you see in the US, where you get elite immigration out of India, which we'll also be looking at later. And most of the Western ones are positive, and the ones that are not positive is this one, Bulgaria, which most people probably wouldn't consider exactly Western. But the reason it's colored this way is that, as I said before, in Denmark, they consider Western countries to be any one in the EU plus the British offshoots. So these are United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, plus the EU. Everybody else is non-Western. So that's how they split it. But if you were to just be general, you'd just say Western is good, non-Western is bad on average. A different way of looking at the same thing is looking at reasons for why people are in the country. In this particular case, they're looking in Danish data among the working age people for which kind of legal justification they have for staying in Denmark. And the left plot here is about people who are in the working age population, but who are unemployed. And what we see is that people who came in for this is work. People came in for work but are currently unemployed are net negative, and the same thing for people who came in to study but are currently unemployed are net negative. If people who came in for asylum, they're very net negative. And there's no line here for the Western ones because Western people never come for asylum reasons. Apparently no internet. Let's see. Sorry about that. And these are the ones that are family reunion ones. And so we see that these plots are quite similar by color, which means that when we subset to people who are in the working age population outside of work and have the same reason for staying in Denmark, their contributions are about the same whether they're Western or non-Western. So statistically speaking, the effect of origin is mediated by whether they're employed and what kind of reason they have to be in Denmark, which is not unsurprising. If instead we look at people who are employed, still working age, we see much the same thing, is that people who are in Denmark for working reasons, they're quite positive, and people who are here to study are also quite positive. People who came here for asylum but still ended up employed, they're also slightly positive, as long as they're working age. And people who did family reunion are also quite positive, whether they're Western or non-Western. And in fact, we can see that the non-Westerns are actually slightly more positive than the Western ones when they are in work, and that's probably because of a collider effect. This one is family reunion people, and the reason for this is probably that when you import non-Western family members and they get employed, they tend to be less selected than you are, and That means they're going to be further down the net contribution estimate. And so what this means is that even if we were to have immigration policy that says we will only admit doctors, the doctors will bring their wives or husbands or kids, and these people will on average be less selected than the doctors themselves and regress somewhat to the mean. And this is what we see here. And here's a different way of plotting the same data. It's still Danish. Here we're looking at people who are in Denmark for this is the entire population, so Danes, mostly Danes. This is people who came here for asylum. They're extremely negative, even in working age. And these are the people who came here for family reunion. The red one, it's almost positive, slightly positive at age 50 or so, but it basically stays below the line, and which means that these will be net negative throughout their lives. If, however, we look at people who come here for work reasons or study reasons, we see that these do almost as well as the natives, maybe exactly as well. So what we can really say is that if you were to think from an economic perspective and you want people who are at least don't cost you more money, you're basically not interested in people who come here for asylum or people who do family reunion. You're interested in people who come here to work or to study. One important thing to keep in mind for some of these data is the recency effect. I don't know what exactly they call it, but it's basically that if you come to a new country, you haven't really found your place yet, you haven't found a place to live. Sometimes, in fact, you live in a camp and aren't allowed to leave it, and so it's quite difficult for you to actually contribute to society. And the way this looks is that you can look at people, how well they're doing, according to how long they've been in a country. And a simple way of looking at it is that this plot shows the employment rate by reason for stay. And so we look at the people who came here to work. They have quite high employment rates. And we look at people who came here to for other reasons. I'm not sure what that covers. They're still quite high. If you came here to study, they're somewhat lower, but that's probably because most of these are students. And if you look at people for asylum, they're quite low, but they're improving recently. And so this value here refers to the year people, the year of data. So basically we see that people who are here for asylum reasons, who came around 14, 15, 16, they had very low employment rates, but they're improving because we didn't get so many new immigrants in these years, and the ones who came here, they've now found some work. So they're improving, but they're still not caught up. This one is a similar way of looking at the same thing, but not too interesting to us here. The same sort of results can be seen in other countries. Here we have Norway again, and this one they've done it in a different way, and here we're looking at immigration cohorts, so groups of people who came into Norway at different years. And so we see here the blue line is people who came into Norway in 92 or 90 or so, and they had of course very low employment rates to begin with, but after 5 years or so they almost hit their the limit and to how far they're going to be getting. And you can see it takes some years for people to hit their full, and then afterward it kind of tapers off a little bit. These are only looking at adults 18 to 47. You see the same thing for women, except that their slope is lower, and you can see different cohorts have different asymptotes, and this probably reflects that people came from different cohorts, are different groups of people. Maybe some of these are Yugoslavian people who were at war, and maybe these are some different people. You can't really tell from this, but that's probably going to be the explanation for this. Somehow the people who came in about the 2000s, they topped out very early, and people who came later doing better, and the people who came earlier. So if one were to look into more, you could figure out what kind of people came at this point of time and what's the issue with them. And here's a similar result for Sweden. We're again looking at recency effects, but this time for net contribution. And what we have on the x-axis is the years since immigration to Sweden. And the blue one is the incomes, the state income, and the red is the state costs. And so you want the blue line to be higher than the red line. This one is the ratio. Well, I don't know what they call it. No, not the ratio. The netto. Yeah, the netto. So you can see that just like in Denmark, working age or people who've been here for a while are only slightly positive. The main limitation of this graph is that it's only about refugees, and so presumably it only refers to the asylum seekers, the sort of people who were in a war-torn country, Somalians, Yugoslavians, this sort of thing. But basically it replicates the Danish results in that even in the best case scenario where these people have been in Sweden for 20, 10, 30, even 40 years, they're still not net benefits much. A different way of looking at the employment rates. Here we're going to be looking at Danish data again. These are the Westerns, and these ones are the non-Westerns. And the blue line, as usual, the dark blue is the Danish reference. The light blue is the first generation, and the red is the second generation. And what we see is that Danish people, they work more than the other groups throughout their entire lives. And especially the first generation Westerns is quite far below the Danish one. But we see that in the second generation there is some improvement, which, as mentioned earlier, could be due to better integration, or maybe just because these are different people. If we look at the non-Westerns, we see a similar result, but that the first generation non-Western is the employment rates are not very high, about 50% even in the age 40 or so. But they improve quite a bit, about halfway up to the Danish norms in the second generation. And so we still need to get it up here, because as remember before that in a country, a welfare state like Denmark, or basically any other welfare state, the average native citizen will be about net zero or slightly net positive, which means that any group or any person who's below the average native or the native group as a whole will be a net negative, and so you want to avoid that. A different way of looking at it is that we can get employment rates for the same country of origin and in different host countries. And what happened recently is that the Danish Statistics Agency, they compiled these data from their Scandinavian colleagues in Sweden and Norway for a small number of countries, and there are data for I think 11 countries and in each of the three Scandinavian host countries. And what we really see is that some countries had very low employment rates. We look at Syria, it's quite low. If we look at Somalia, it's quite low. Iraq, it's quite low, but higher than the other two. And the heights of these bars are quite similar, depending on which host country we're in. And what this statistically tells us is that the effect of origin is very strong compared to which kind of host country you end up with. So Sweden doesn't have any super magic that makes people from Somalia work a lot more than they do in Denmark. Maybe there's something with Syrians here. Maybe it has to do with recent refugee crisis, or maybe they calculate the values somewhat differently. If you were to take the employment rates of these, I think 11 countries, and correlate them, what you get is that you get a mean correlation of 8.6, which is just to say that the countries that send you people that work a lot in Sweden are the same ones that send people who work a lot in Denmark and Norway. If you plot it, it looks like this. I just put the national IQ as the x-axis because I had to put something. There's also some Finnish data. Recently there was a Finnish report and with an English summary, and they calculated net benefits or net contributions for origin groups in the same way the Danish one did, except less detailed because they did not have access to very detailed registered data. It was not made by the Finnish Statistical Agency, it was made by, I believe, someone associated with the True Finns party. In any case, if we are to plot these against the Danish ones for the overlapping group of 9 countries, we see that the values are quite consistent. The countries that are net negative in Denmark, which is all of these, are also the ones that are quite net negative in Finland. Maybe an odd thing is that Swedish people are net negative in Finland, which is odd, and Chinese as well. But overall, they're quite similar. Correlation 8-9. And if we are to zoom out and have a more global perspective, here I've looked at people who immigrate to United States and people who immigrate to Western Europe. And what we see is the distribution of education by the people who immigrate to these two destinations. And we see in general that in the United States, education levels are mainly tilted towards people with high education for most countries of origin, and the exceptions are Mexico and Central America. And that's why, of course, when you look at the US, you see that people, for instance, from India, they do very well, and that's because people who come from India and go to US, or from East Asia or East Europe, they are not very representative of where they're from, because not many people are highly educated in India, and so if somehow the immigrants you get from India are highly educated, you know you've got some of the elites. For Mexico, Central America, you can see that it's exactly the other way around, that as Trump says, they're not sending their best, and that's why probably the debate is mostly about these, and also, of course, because these are in the largest numbers. In Western Europe, we see the opposite result, in that most countries most origins are skewed somewhat towards the less educated or the middle educated, and especially the Middle East, which is North Africa. These are the ones that cause the most media discussion, any kind of immigrant opposition. Of course, there's not a lot of people immigrating from Mexico to Europe, so these countries don't really matter much because there's very few immigrants from these. A different way of looking at the same is this follow-up plot. It's based on the same data as this one, and what we've done instead is put both destinations on the same, and we simply just subtract the high from the low, and we see that you want to have positive ones because that gives you more highly educated people compared to low educated people. And so in the US we see that all these bars are green except for Central America and Mexico, and the Mexico one is extremely negative, and that's they get more than 4 million net low educated workers I think a year, which is why they get such huge problems. In Europe, however, you see the opposite. There's a lot of net negative education, immigration from these from East Europe as well as North America and Middle East, and these of course are the Muslim regions and the ones that cause the most public debate and so on. So overall, to summarize, the overall net economic contribution of immigrants are generally negative in Nordic countries, and this is mainly due to having most of the immigrants from non-Western countries that don't work very much, and also because the second generation people are quite young. The net contribution from people from what we call low IQ or Muslim origins is very negative, as we saw in some of the charts. I won't go into much of this here because I already covered it in my video here, which you can click. The age distribution and recency of immigrants have a large effect on the results, and these can be misleading if we don't think of them. To reiterate the one before, when we look at the second generation immigrants in Denmark, they're extremely net negative, and the reason for this is that many of them almost all of them are below 30, and almost everybody below age 20 don't contribute anything at all, and so that's why they spend a lot of money. But you can adjust for this in your model, and then you are not misled the same way. Still, however, if you do age adjustment, which is essentially the same as forecasting what the indefinite future will be contribution of this group, it's quite negative for non-West migrations to Europe or in Denmark, Norway, these countries. It's the other way around for the Western immigrants. The Western ones, depending on how exactly you define it, are either doing just about the same as the natives in the Nordic countries, or slightly below if you look at the people from East Europe, Southern Europe, these countries. The differences in economic impacts are mainly due to different rates of employment and income, and in particularly if you look at the reason people are in a given country, you can look at the people who are net positive, and these are the people who came there to work or to study, not too surprising. And you can see the people who are net negative are people who came as refugees, asylum, or family reunions. And so if you are interested in, say, having a more net positive or net positive immigration, you want to have fewer asylum people and fewer family reunion people and more work-study people, or just fewer overall. There's different ways you can do it depending on what your goals and your policy preferences are. Migrant selection finally can have quite large effects, as we talked about. Indians in the US and even in Denmark, Indians are above average. References are given here to these various Danish reports, Norwegian, Swedish ones, Finnish ones, and a few of these studies. Finally, if you want more of this kind of video, you basically want to go here and click subscribe somewhere, and then I will get more money, and then I can make more of these. See you.